congregations. I spoke here in 2021. I don't remember the lectureship I spoke at in October. Is it in October? Yeah. And one of the men from the Magic Valley congregation at Twin Falls contacted me, and so I've been working with that congregation. A lot of good things happening there, and so I just appreciate the opportunity to make those connections through the lectureship and to get to be a part of that. So thank you for having that, and thank you for just being so good to me. And I hope to be able to return that favor. Today, as I mentioned, in the work that I do, a lot of things that I try to deal with is helping congregations in creating a vision for their congregation, to be able to see who they want to be as they think about 5 or 10 years down the road, and what does that look like. And so over the years, I've kind of developed this way of looking at vision through a biblical focus. And my wife is so funny the way this happened. I was working with a congregation in Louisiana, and so I went through this particular material that I was dealing with, and when I got in the car, she said, "I just knew that you were going to say that vision is about having the right biblical focus." I was like, "What?" She said, "You had a word for the F, you had a word for the C, you had a word for the U, you had a word for the S. You just need to come up with a word for O." And I was like, the wisdom of my wife. So today you're going to get my wife's version. No, you're going to get this idea about having a right biblical focus. If we're going to have vision for the church, for our own lives as Christians, we need to have the right biblical focus. And of course, it's an acronym, and each letter in the word focus stands for something to help us in that area about having the right biblical focus. And the letter F stands for faith. If we're going to have the right biblical focus, doesn't that make sense that the foundational piece would be faith? And when we think about faith, faith is critical. Everywhere we read in the Bible, from the Old Testament through the New Testament, it is so critical to think about this idea of faith. But the one chapter that stands out is Hebrews chapter 11. I don't know if you want to turn over there. I want to point out a couple of things about Hebrews chapter 11, and you're probably very familiar with this chapter and talking about the concept of faith and why faith is so important to us. But the chapter begins with defining for us faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, and it's the conviction of things not seen. Now, I want to key on that idea about the conviction of things not seen. If we can see it, it's not really faith, is it? You know, you've heard that old concept, seeing is believing. Well, I think it's really the reverse when it comes to our relationship with God, and certainly this idea of vision. Believing is seeing. And that's what the writer is trying to tell us. Faith is this conviction of things not seen. And I would really encourage you, when you get an opportunity, to read through chapter 11 and just highlight all of the times this idea of what is seen or what is not seen, that which is visible, that which is not visible. Highlight those things from that chapter. It's pretty interesting. For example, in verse 3 it says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of that which is visible." The writer of the book of Hebrews is trying to tell us that in the beginning we weren't there. When God created all things, by faith we understand that He spoke and brought into existence something out of nothing. That's a pretty cool thought, isn't it? Takes faith. And then we read about Enoch just a few verses down in verse 5, and Enoch was one who did not see death. There are only two people in the Bible that are noted as those who never saw death. Enoch was one of them. Anybody know who the other was? Elijah. Yeah. Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind, in a chariot of fire. I would love that, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be cool? He didn't see death. Well, Enoch didn't see death. And then as you continue down, this is probably one of my favorites, is about Noah. Here's Noah that we read about, that by faith prepared an ark to the salvation of his household because he was warned by God about things not yet seen. Now, I get people sometimes, they're like, is it because he had never seen it rain? Had it never rained up until the time of the flood? Or was it because he never saw a flood? I don't care. I don't care whether it had never rained. I don't care if he had never seen a flood. What's important to me is that by faith, he prepared an ark because he was warned about something he had never seen. Now, there are other places. You can read through the chapter and do that yourself, but I want to bring your attention down to verses 23 and following. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 and following, we read, first of all, about Amram and Jochebed, who are the parents of Moses. And by faith, when Moses was born, they hid him for 3 months, not fearing the king's edict. Now, the text tells us when they saw he was a beautiful child. Now, I don't do this anymore. I used to tell people I have 10 of the most beautiful grandchildren on the planet. But every time I would say that, I'd always get resistance from somebody in the group that they had grandchildren. And even though I would tell them, I've got the evidence on my phone, I will show you the pictures, they still did not believe. Now, I'll just tell you, when I read about Amram and Jochebed and the fact that when they saw that Moses was a beautiful child, they hid him for 3 months, I don't believe for a moment that Amram and Jochebed picked up that baby and said, I want you to look at the hair on that child. Isn't that the most beautiful baby you've ever seen? I don't think that's what the writer of the book of Hebrews is talking about, and certainly not what he's talking about in a chapter on faith and this contrast between what is seen and that which is not seen. And he's trying to tell us that when they saw, they were seeing through the eye of faith. They had a vision for what this child would be in the future because the promise that God had made to Israel. Now here's what's really cool. When they raised him, you know that they had to have instilled in him something when he was just a child, before he was weaned and sent to Pharaoh's daughter. You know they had to instill something in him about that. Because the text continues to show us that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing to endure ill affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. But notice verse 27. Verse 27 tells us that Moses was able to see him who is unseen. You see, believing is seeing. So when we think about this idea of having the right biblical focus, if our vision is about having the right biblical focus, then the foundation for that has to be faith. And it's not a faith in ourselves. It's not a faith in the ability we can accomplish on our own. It's about a faith that we have in Him who is unseen. That's the right biblical focus. Now, the letter O is the one my wife came up with. And I'll tell you, she is so incredibly smart. But the idea of O, when we think about having the right biblical focus, is about opportunity. No vision was ever achieved without being able to see the opportunity. Do you know what an opportunity is? An opportunity, by definition, is circumstances that present possibility either to be gained or lost. Now think about that. An opportunity is a circumstance or a set of circumstances that present a possibility either to be gained or lost. And if we can't see the possibilities, we'll never take advantage of the opportunity. Now, one of my favorite accounts in all of Scripture comes in John chapter 4. If you want to turn over there, you're probably very familiar with this chapter. It's the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. And there are a lot of reasons why I love this text. Because when you think about Jesus and his encounter with this woman, he's sitting there at the well. He's kind of wearied from his journeys. It's that time of day. And she comes and he's like, give me a drink. He's asking her for a drink. And she's like, how is it that you, being a Jew, would ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? And then John tells us there in that parenthetical statement, for Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. And so Jesus then engages her in this conversation. And I'll tell you, for me, the most chilling part about this text is the very next statement. Because Jesus says to her, if you knew the gift of God. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. I've noticed these posters on each side about knowing Jesus is more important than knowing anything. And here Jesus is talking to this woman and he says, if you knew the gift of God. And it makes me wonder, do we know? Do we know Him? Because he says if you knew the gift of God, you would ask Him for a drink and He would give you living water. Now this woman is totally confused, as probably most of us would have been. She's like, sir, the well is deep and you have nothing to draw with. Where do you get this living water? And Jesus says, everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I give them will never thirst again, but it will become this well springing up in them to eternal life. She's like, give me of this water. I mean, wouldn't you? I mean, if your job was to walk all the way to that well, to draw water, to take back to your people, wouldn't you like to have some water that you could take back that if you drink from it, you will never be thirsty again? But she's still not getting it. And Jesus says, go call your husband. And she's like, I don't have a husband. Wouldn't you love to have seen the look on her face when Jesus said to her, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is not your husband. And she says, sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Now the conversation changes here because she shifts the idea of talking about this water and this living water to the idea of worship. And of course you know that text about how that our people say that we're to worship on the mountain, but you people say in Jerusalem is where we're supposed to worship. And Jesus tells her, time is coming, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. God is seeking true worshipers, those who will worship Him in spirit and truth. And then, after that discussion, she says, I know that when the Messiah comes, He will reveal to us all things. Now that phrase, all things, is very important because Jesus is going to say to her, I am He. He's telling her, I am the Messiah that you're looking for. She is going to leave her pot and she's going to go back to her people, and notice what she says to them. Come and see a man who told me all things about myself. This is not the Christ, is it? You see, they were looking, they knew and anticipating that the Messiah was going to come, and she knew that when He came, He was going to reveal all things. And when this man revealed all things about her to her, she's like, this has to be the Christ. And of course, the people come out, and Jesus is going to stay a couple of days there with them. And they're going to say, no longer is it because of what you said that we believe, but we have seen and heard for ourselves and come to believe that this one is the Savior of the world. Now, I've been talking for about 5 minutes telling that story, and I don't know if you're thinking this or not, but a lot of times people are like, what on earth does this have to do with opportunity? Well, I'll tell you. I have read that chapter. I have taught that chapter. I don't know how many times in my ministry. And a few years ago, I was reading that text and I saw something I had never noticed before. In fact, the translators give it a whole verse to itself. How I missed it, I have no idea. It's verse 4. In John chapter 4, verse 4, the text says, and he had to pass through Samaria. And I read that and I thought, wait a minute. No, he didn't. He didn't have to pass through Samaria. In fact, Jews did everything in their power not to go through Samaria because they didn't want to encounter Samaritans. But the text says Jesus had to pass through Samaria. And that's when it dawned on me that Jesus was able to see the opportunity that was there. He knew the possibilities that existed because he knew there was a woman who was going to be there at that well, and he was going to encounter her, and that the end result was going to be reaching her people. Now, to me, I wonder sometimes, are we able to see the possibilities before us? Because again, if we can't see the possibilities, we never take advantage of the opportunity. Now, I will just tell you, one of the greatest opportunities that we have, and has the incredible possibilities of reaching so many people in our world that we rarely take advantage of, is our website. A church's website. Now, I'll just be honest, I haven't gone to your website. It may be incredible. I hope it is. But most churches that I have visited, when I go to their websites, do you want to know the first thing that they have on their website? Anybody know? No, some of them put that in the text down in there, but most people have a picture of their building. Now, don't misunderstand me, but what does that communicate to people that the church is? If the church is truly the people, then why are we putting a picture of our building? What does that communicate to our communities? Now, I ask congregations, who are you trying to reach with your website? Who is it for? Because if your website is for the church, don't change it. But if your website is to reach people in your community, then there has to be some changes made to that website. Because we load our websites up with content. We put all of this content on there. We have the 5 steps to becoming a Christian. We have the 5 acts of worship. We want people to know all this stuff. But you know, I've never met one person yet in my life. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just saying I've never met anybody that said, you know, I went to this website and I read how to become a Christian and that's how I was converted. I've never met one person that said that. And we're living in a time when people don't read. Yet we continue to put content on there. Now they will listen and they will look, but they're not going to read. Our websites need to be loaded with pictures of people. You want to know the 2 main questions that people in communities ask when it comes to a church? 1, what do I have to wear? Because they're afraid they won't fit in if they come in their casual clothes. 2, they want to know, do you have kids? And if we're not showing them pictures of those things, they're not going to come. Are we missing out on an opportunity because we can't see the possibilities of what can happen by using this tool that God has given us to reach our communities? Because here's the thing, people are converted because they meet somebody that they trust who is able to teach them and share Jesus with them. 96+% of people who become Christians is because of a friend or a family member. It's not the preacher. It's not going to be what they read. It's going to be because somebody they trust. And when people come through those doors and they meet a group of people that love on them, care about them, will sit next to them, they might just come back. We might be able to develop a relationship. It's opportunity. Can we see the possibilities? Because a biblical vision is about having this right focus. The right biblical focus means we've got to have a foundation, but we also have to be able to see the opportunities that are there. And if we'll take advantage of those opportunities, we're going to see growth. Now, the letter C in the word focus stands for confidence. Now, in the Old Testament, do you remember this account where the children of Israel had come out of Egypt, they'd crossed the Red Sea, and they're coming up to the Promised Land. They hadn't crossed into it yet. And Moses is going to take one person from each of the 12 tribes to go and spy out the land. Do you remember that? Do you remember what happened? He tells them, I want you to go in and I want you to find out what kind of people are living there. Are there giants in the land? What kind of cities do they live in? Are they fortified cities? And then he says, I want you to bring back, get this, some fruit. I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of an odd request. If you're spying out the land, you want to know what kind of people live there, if there are giants in the land, what kind of cities they live in, and if they're fortified cities. And then, oh, by the way, bring back some fruit. Now, I tell you, I love this, but I would love to eat a grape that had to be carried on a pole between two men. A cluster of grapes that had to be carried on a pole between two men. I'd like to have one of those grapes. I don't know, was it the size of a softball? Was it the size of a bowling ball? I don't know, but I'd sure like to try it and see what it tasted like. And then I kind of realized, okay, they'd been promised for 400 years that God was going to give them this land that was flowing with milk and honey. I'm sure they wanted evidence to see if it really was what God had said. And so these 12 men, they go into the land and they come back. And you remember the report of the 10 spies? You talk about a problem with vision. They had a problem with vision. Because these 10 spies come back and they report, yes, there's great fruit in the land, but there are giants in the land. And they live in fortified cities. We can't do it. And the statement they make is, we were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were in our own. Now, I don't know if you remember the text or not, but that's the way I've told that story most of my life. And I happened to be reading that story here not too long ago and realized I'd been saying it wrong all these years. The statement is not, we were as grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were in our own. It's the other way around. We were as grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in theirs. Isn't that interesting? The way they saw themselves is what impacted the way that the people in the land saw them. And because they saw themselves as being small and unable to go in and take the land, they were afraid, and they brought back a bad report. We call it the grasshopper syndrome. But I think the problem is vision. You see, vision is about confidence, but the problem with them is their confidence was not in God, their confidence was in themselves. And because their confidence was in themselves, when they realized they couldn't go in and fight the evil, then all their hope of taking the land was gone. But there were two men, Caleb and Joshua. The two men who said, we can go in. God will go before us. He will fight the battles for us. You see, they had the right vision because their confidence was not in themselves, it was in God. You know, one of the things I love about Caleb, I always wanted a grandson named Caleb. I never got one. I tried. I really tried. I mean, I've got 10, and 9 of them have biblical names. I have a Malachi, I have an Isaiah, I have a Titus, I have a Naomi, I have a Nehemiah, I have an Elias, I have an Elizabeth, I have a Hannah, I have a Benjamin, and then I have Everett. I wanted Caleb so bad. And I'll tell you why I love Caleb so much is because after they've gone in and they've conquered almost all of the land, Caleb is going to come up to Joshua and he's going to say, I'm 85 years old today. And my strength is today as it was when Moses sent us into the land. Now give me this mountain. You see, there were giants in the mountain, but Caleb wasn't afraid of the giants. And the reason he wasn't afraid of the giants is because his confidence was not in himself. His confidence was in God who would fight the battles for him. Now, I'll just tell you, one of our biggest challenges in the church today is we tend to set goals, make plans, and create visions that are based upon what we can do on our own. We think way too small. Now, I'm going to ask you this question a little bit later in the sermon, but I want you to think about something for just a moment. What would you do if you knew you could not fail? Isn't that an interesting question? What would you do? I've talked about that so much, my daughter bought me a little paperweight that I keep on my desk that has that question. Every day I get to look at that. What would you do if you knew you could not fail? I asked that question one time to a group of students in Tanzania. And Denny Petrillo was sitting in the back of the room. And he came up to me after the class. He said, you know, when you asked that question, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? In my mind, I thought, well, we'd evangelize all of Tanzania. And then I thought, well, we'd evangelize all of Africa. And he said, and then I thought, wait a minute. If I can think that, then we're going to have to do that. You see, the thing is, with God, we can't fail. Can we? I mean, if God is for us, who can be against us, right? The question is, do we believe that? You see, what happens is that what we do is we tend to set our goals and our plans based upon what we can accomplish on our own, or we look at our track record over the last 10 years and we think, well, we haven't grown in the last 10 years more than about 4 or 5 people a year, so we ought to set our goals to be about that. I'm telling you, that's small thinking. What could we do if we knew we couldn't fail? Well, I'll tell you, if we put our confidence in God and stop putting it in ourselves, we will be amazed. Because I'm telling you, God can do it. The right biblical focus is about faith. That's the foundation. It's also about opportunity. It's the ability to see the possibilities so that we can take advantage of that opportunity. But it's also about confidence. Now, the next letter in the word focus is the letter U. And the letter U stands for the idea of being united. It's unity. It's the ability to work together. One of the great books in the Bible that we tend to look at when we think about the idea of leadership is the book of Nehemiah. I don't know how many books have been written about it. I don't know how many people I've heard talk about the idea of leadership from the standpoint of the book of Nehemiah. But the book of Nehemiah is an incredible book, but the most unread chapter in the book of Nehemiah, and perhaps the most unread chapter in the Bible, is Nehemiah chapter 3. You know, Nehemiah's got this great story. You start out in chapter 1, and you have a brother of Nehemiah and some men from Jerusalem that have come, and he inquires about what's taking place in Jerusalem, and they give this bad report. They say, you know, the walls have been torn down, the gates have been burned, and then they're going to make this statement, and the people are in reproach. And because of that, what happens is Nehemiah will sit down and he will weep and he will mourn for days. And he's going to fast and he's going to pray to the God of heaven. When you think about the situation in the church today on a universal level, when's the last time that we sat down and wept and mourned for days, fasted and prayed to the God of heaven? Now we have part of that prayer, I think, recorded there for us. And then talk about taking advantage of an opportunity. The last verse of chapter 1 tells us, and I was cupbearer to the king. I mean, Nehemiah saw an opportunity here because he could see the possibilities. He was working for the king. The king wants to know why he's sad. He says, you're not sick. It's a sadness of heart. And he says, why would I not be sad when the city of my ancestors lies desolate and in ruins? And the king says, what would you request? And what does Nehemiah do? He says, I prayed to the God of heaven. And so he's going to take advantage of this opportunity, and he's going to ask for a letter to give to get free passage into Jerusalem, but also a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to have timber so that he can rebuild the gates. He's going to go back. He's going to investigate the whole situation there in chapter 2. And so we have this great narrative, how he gathers everybody together and he says, you see the situation that exists? You know, the wall's been torn down, the gates have been burned. He says, so let us arise and build so that we'll no longer be a reproach. And I told him how the hand of my God had been favorable to me. And the words of the king and the people said, let us arise and build. And they put their hand to the good work. You know, we love that story. We love reading that account. Then we get to chapter 3 and it's kind of like, wait a minute. This is just all about them rebuilding the wall. So let's just jump over here to chapter 4 and let's get back into the narrative. And I'll tell you, Freed Hardeman asked me to teach a lesson one time from the book of Nehemiah. And chapter 3 was not on my radar. And I got to read in chapter 3. And I noticed something very interesting about that chapter. There's a phrase that is used over and over and over again in the first half of that chapter. And there's another phrase, it changes in the second half of the chapter. And I got to thinking, because it's a great chapter that shows us about the rebuilding of the wall. And you know, we don't read about any stonemasons. We don't read about men who that was their skill, that what they did was they laid stone. We read about the leaders, the priests were involved. We have families, dads and daughters are out there working together. We have merchants and jewelers and perfumers. And we got people with all kinds of different professions that are out here helping rebuild the wall. But it was this phrase that really stood out to me that made the difference. In the first half of the chapter, the phrase that's used over and over again is this phrase, and next to. And next to him, this person was working. And next to him, these people were working. And next to them, and next to them, and next to him, and over, you have this phrase, and next to, and next to. And I thought, that's interesting. But the phrase changes in the second half of the book. And the phrase in the second half of the book is, and after him, and after them, and after him, and after them, over and over again. So I got to thinking, okay, what is going on here? What's the point of this? You know, I'm slow sometimes, but I tell you, when the light bulb comes on, it's a great day for me. And I was reading this text, and I realized that in the first half of the chapter, what you have taking place is you have everybody from the leadership down in the trenches working side by side. They were all involved. And I'll just tell you right now, for the church to grow, it's not going to be dependent upon one individual or even a handful of individuals. It's going to take everybody working together in the trenches side by side. That's what it takes to rebuild the wall. That's what it's going to take for the church to grow, is everybody working. And then I realized that in the last half of the chapter, people can only build so high. And then you got to have somebody else who comes along after them who's able to continue to build on that wall till it's completed. Now, the congregation here at Linder Road, I don't know the history well enough to know when it started, but I have pretty good feeling, like most congregations, that the congregation here started with a group of people who years ago believed and saw the vision that there needed to be a church of the Lord's people that met here in Meridian. And so they began putting stones in the wall. But they only built so high. And now you have come along after them, and you are building on that wall. My question to you is this: what kind of church will you leave for the next generation? Will they be able to come along after you and the foundation that you have laid and build on that so that the people in Meridian and beyond are able to know Jesus. It takes unity. It's sad to me to think that the church in the 21st century is more divided than it's ever been in its history. Since it was started in 33 AD, I noticed there's a plaque on the outside of the brick wall here as you come in the entrance. It says, the Church of Christ established or started AD 33 in Jerusalem. Since that time to the day, we today in the world are more divided than we've ever been. And we've got to fix that. We've got to find ways that we can fix that. Because if we're going to reach people in this world for Jesus, and if we're going to overcome the power of the evil one, we can't do it divided. We've got to unite. And we have got to work together. And we've got to have a vision for that. And to have that kind of vision, we're going to have the right biblical focus. Which means we've got to build on the foundation of faith. We've got to see the possibilities so that we can take advantage of the opportunity. We're going to have confidence not in ourselves but in who our God is. And we're going to have to be united. We're going to have to work together in the trenches side by side. The letter S in the word focus stands for sacrifice. No vision has ever been achieved without sacrifice. It takes sacrifice. I watched a show, I don't know how long ago it was. I'm almost hesitant to tell you who the star was in that show because I'm not a big fan of Billy Ray Cyrus, but he was a country doctor. I don't know if you ever saw the show or not. It's called Doc. And he was this country doctor that had moved up to the big city, and he was working in a hospital there. And at the end of the episode, each time there was a little statement of something he had learned throughout that process. He's writing back to a friend who had helped him go into medicine and help him to really get involved in being a doctor. I don't remember hardly any of the episodes. In fact, the only one I remember is this one. And what I remember is he wrote back and he said to his friend, he said that what he learned was that love is not so much what you give, love is what you give up. That's sacrifice. And I think about our God who from the beginning knew and had a plan because He knew of the sin that would just wreck our lives and the world that we live in. And He had a plan that He would send His Son who would be willing, because of His love for us, to give up His life so that we could be made righteous in the eyes of our God, to enjoy the pleasures and the benefits of His grace and His mercy. And it's all about love. And love is about what we give up. And when I think about the idea of sacrifice, we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up for Jesus? You remember the account where Jesus tells the apostles in John 13 that He's about to go away and that where He's going they cannot come? And Peter, who always so impetuous, is the first to speak up here in this text, as on many occasions. And he wants to know, where are you going? He says, I want to go. He says, I'm willing to lay down my life for you. And Jesus asks one of the most pointed questions in all of Scripture. He says, will you? Will you lay down your life for me? And of course, we know that He goes on to tell him that before the cock crows, He's going to deny Him 3 times. We know the account. We know how it plays out. That it's that question that haunts me. And I never ask for a show of hands. I never ask people to say, will you lay down your life for Jesus? Would you be willing to die for Jesus? I think we would all say in this moment, yes. But I don't think that's the right question we have to ask. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is this: will you live for Him? Because if we're not willing to live for Him, we would never be willing to die for Him. And the sacrifice that we make when it comes to our God and our Savior demands nothing less than a whole and complete sacrifice. You remember Romans chapter 12, where Paul says, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God. And he goes on to say, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove that which is good, that perfect will of God. There's a phrase that's used here in that verse 1. He says, present your bodies. You know what that word present means? It's borrowed by Paul from an Old Testament term that's used in regards to the sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. Because when the children of Israel would bring in their sacrifice and they would present it to the priest, the word there means to surrender all rights of ownership and any plans for future use. Now think about that. They're bringing in this offering and they're saying, I'm surrendering all rights of ownership and any plans that I have for future use to make this offering to God. Now let's look at Romans 12 again and let's insert that definition and see how it reads. I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you surrender all rights of ownership and any plans you had for future use of your life and make a living and holy sacrifice to God. Kind of changes the way we see that, doesn't it? See, it's one thing to say present, but it's another to say surrender. My dad years ago preached for a little congregation in Missouri. They had a guest speaker that came in. I don't know who that guest speaker was, but he preached a lesson on the song that we often sing called I Surrender All. And he said the congregation never sang that song again. You see, having a vision requires the right biblical focus. And that means we got to build on the foundation of faith. It means we got to take advantage of those opportunities. We need to have confidence in who our God is and not in ourselves. We've got to be united and work together. And we have to surrender all. We've got to be willing to make the sacrifice of all. Complete and total sacrifice. And when we do, God will work through us and we will achieve things to His glory that will just unfathomable. And it will change the lives of people, not only in this congregation, but in this community and around the world. Thank you all so much for your attention. I look forward to bringing the lesson here in just a few moments as we talk about and answer the question, who is the Lord? Thank you.